to CTSNet live webinar, Nursing Giants and Mechanical Circulatory Support.
Welcome to CTSNet live webinar, Nursing Giants and Mechanical.
My name is Jill Lay. I'm a clinical nurse specialist in surgical services at California Pacific Medical Center, and I'll be the moderator for this session. I'll be joined today by panelist Jane Reedy, as we knew her, Grindell, who was formerly a Thoratec clinical director, Heartware VP, and now is Vice President of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs at CH Biomedical. Also, Mary Lou O'Hara, former mechanical device coordinator at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Julie Chin, a cardiovascular CNS at Stanford University Medical Center for many years, now retired, but an associate clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco. Mechanical circulatory support has become a standard therapy in intensive care units across the world, with resounding success in preserving life, primarily through destination therapy. But in the 1980s and 1990s, this was a novel therapy fraught with issues that we sought to resolve on a daily basis. It was a true multidisciplinary effort. Today, I am delighted to share the experiences of several outstanding nurses who were early pioneers in these endeavors. And our agenda for today will be roughly to go through the roles of our various members on the team, some state-of-the-art management practices back in the 80s and 90s, patient care practices that are now obsolete, and some lessons for the future. This is my team at California Pacific Medical Center. At the time that I started there in 1983 as a staff nurse, it was known as Pacific Presbyterian Medical Center. I was struck by the outstanding heart transplant team that we had, led by Don Hill, as you see there. It was such an amazing experience. We had engineers that were part of our team. They had a wet lab at our facility, and we would routinely train using that wet lab. The engineers would come on clinical rounds with us, and when asking a question, the nurses were just as likely to get a response from one of the mechanical engineers about the pump as they were about from our clinical intensivists. So it was just an amazing time where we really did all learn from each other. Mary Lou, this is your team at the University of Pennsylvania. Can you please tell us a little bit about your role at the team and how that things worked back in the 80s?
Well, actually, it was back in San Francisco with you, Jill, at Pacific Presbyterian, where I first encountered VAD technology. I was there for the early use of the Thoratec pump, and we had an unbelievable ECMO project going on at that time. It wasn't until I moved back east and I went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania that my role developed in mechanical support. We implanted our first thermocardia systems pneumatic pump in 1995, not ironically in April, to an accountant. And for several years, that is the pump that we utilized. It wasn't until several years later when we started implanting the HeartMate VE that my role was really transitioned from CNS in the unit to a devoted mechanical support. The slide you see here, I'm in clinic with Eddie Rami and Ido Barada to the right. Ido has since moved to Jerusalem to start a program, and Eddie has moved to Jefferson. Over to the left is our first total heart implant, led by Dr. Acker and Dr. Morris. And to the right is our outstanding VAD coordinator who was the one devoted to that program. She's since moved to UCLA. Right now, According to my team, I'm now 5 years, but they have like 116 patients with a variety of devices. Jill, you're muted. I'm not hearing you.
Unmute. There we go. Thank you very much. I realize we're getting some feedback, so we're working on our technical difficulties, and we'll try and mute ourselves when we're not speaking and see if that helps. Thank you. Jane, I know you started at St. Louis, and at that time you published this wonderful article, but then we really knew you as our Thoratech resource. Can you comment just a bit about your roles as you embarked on these programs?
Sure. So I started my mechanical support career at St. Louis University, and we had a wonderful team. We were one of the original durable VAD centers at that time. I think Dr. Pennington did his first bridge patient with the Thoratech PVAD in 1982. He was really our leader. And a couple people I want to mention that weren't on this slide is Dr. Leslie Miller. He was our heart failure cardiologist and did a great job referring patients. And then Larry McBride, who was the other cardiac surgeon. But our core team was Mark Schwartz, and he was our researcher. Shelley Ruzovich and I were the clinical nurse specialists. And Dave Turbulin was an engineer. So way back in the early 80s, we realized the importance of a team approach to circulatory support. We did different things. Our core team, we just focused on mechanical support. So we helped with patient selection, we did patient management, technical support, and a lot of education, interaction with patients and their families. And we were a publication machine at St. Louis University, so did a lot of the original publications way back when.
Yeah, it was definitely a small community at that time. I was so struck by this photo, Julie, of the research that your team did at Stanford, and was hoping you could comment not only on your clinical team, but also the research work that went on at Stanford.
Yeah, what you see here is, this isn't our whole team. The slide implies that we had a sheep and 2 other people. What you're seeing here is actually a sheep from the animal facility out on battery with the Novacor, and obviously the sheep sort of experienced all the effects, benefits of the pump prior to the nursing staff. But we used the animal facility to do some of our training to get staff ready for our first implant. And on the left there is Betty Ann Green, who ran the animal facility, and Phil Miller, who is an engineer with Novacor, who was instrumental in helping to develop the device. Also not pictured is Dr. Phil Oyer, who did the first successful bridge to transplant with a Novacor device in 1984, and Pierre Portner, who was the man that developed the Novacor pump with his colleagues. Jal Jaswala is another person that comes to mind. But our group was small starting out. So again, we did a lot of our initial training actually with the engineers from Novacor and with the animals in the animal facility before our first patient arrived.
And I remember we had an animal lab at Pacific Presbyterian, but our nurses weren't particularly involved in that. It was more the wet lab where we were working.
Actually, we had our engineers also participate, or Phil Miller in particular, participate in some of the initial training of our initial group of staff that took care of these patients. Yeah,
very different time. So Jane, you really were instrumental in training a lot of us around the world, as your expertise with Thoratech was renowned. Can you just kick off what were the big priorities in patient care, and What were we thinking about back there in the 1980s?
Sure. So the patient care back in the 1980s in many ways is similar to the patient care that we see today. The technology's changed, but the basics, many of the basics haven't changed. Now, in reference to the technology, if you see on the lower picture, that's the Thoratec PVAD console. So unfortunately, I don't have many pictures from my days at St. Louis University, but we actually had a console that drove that pump that was at least twice the size of the Thoratec console. In the early 80s, there were no batteries in our consoles, so literally used electrical power cords to get the patient from the OR to the ICU. That console overheated, so no one liked to be in the room for too long because it was so hot. This patient in that picture, you can see, this is obviously a pre-COVID picture, but we did some studies back then and looked at T cells and immunosuppression, and thought that reverse isolation was a good idea. That didn't last very long, but we did that for a period of time. You can see the Thoratec PVAD illustration, the exit sites. One of the things we learned back then was don't use acetone to take off tape. The outer casing actually exploded. So there's a very good article, I couldn't track it down, that tells you how to actually pump those blood diaphragms and exchange the pump. So it was very interesting as far as we did post-cardiotomy at first. So the trends back then was to avoid putting the Thoratec PVAD in at all costs. So the patients had unbelievable bleeding complications. Bleeding is still common today, but I hope you're not seeing the bleeding that we saw way back then that was related to the long bypass times. I mean, we had some patients so sick that would come up on the OR table. And so we would have a victory in the morning if the patient was still alive and he was able to move or she was able to move to a real bed. So it was exciting times. One of the other things was we had to make sure the nurses knew if a Thoratec patient with BiVADs was in VFib, they didn't have to panic and basically throw the patient back in the bed. We knew patients didn't even know they had VFib. Some of the patients, they'd be sitting up eating, and someone would look at the EKG and see that the patient was in VFib and just panic. So we learned early on not to panic. So those are some of the memories from my recollection of the 80s.
Thank you. You were definitely one of the first to experience these sorts of things. One of my recollections was that when these patients came back from the operating room, it was always something new and different. That's our hospital on the right. And you can see that, you know, these devices were quite large extracorporeal devices. We would, you know, use something like foam, as you see here,
use something
to get them positioned properly. And again, you know, we were figuring it out as we went along. We didn't know if we could turn this patient. We had to wait and see what the surgeons wanted us to do. So Mary Lou, I know this is your patient on the left. Can you please give us just a little bit of an idea, unmute yourself and tell us what's going on with this gentleman and in this very unusual positioning with the device?
It was quite a time. One of the roles I had was being in the operating room because I was part of the team down there. And occasionally, Dr. Acker at the time, who was our main implanting surgeon, found himself facing a really significantly challenging operative approach. This was a patient who had a tremendous calcified LV apex. So he managed to put it in this rather unique, I call it the takeoff approach. And it also brought in, when we got back to the unit, trying to devise ways to keep it in its critical position, because as soon as it moved, the patient was in profound pulmonary edema. So that's when I pulled in occupational therapy, who had these multiple splints, and we divide this platform. It was, another nursing challenge that we utilized other collaborative members of our team to help keep the patient safe.
Thank you. I recall therapy and was also quite helpful in some of our patients in terms of designing things of that nature. Additionally, the wound care protocols themselves were really being devised as we went along. We followed the lead of our surgeons. These are pictures from my institution. And we were big proponents of chlorhexidine. And so we would take 4x4, saturate them in that pink CHG, wrap the cannula sites with those. And that was our protocol for the first week or two. We attempted to maintain aseptic technique. Certainly that urinal being in the picture made me wonder how rigorous we were with those techniques once patients had been out for a few weeks or so. Julie, could you please comment? I know, you were one of the facilities that were using a number of pumps, and really, how did you have to pivot based on what type of device you were using? Great.
Sorry, I'm trying to keep muted to minimize feedback. What you're seeing here is a interesting picture. The hardware sitting in the palm of somebody's hand is on the right or on your left, and next to it is the NovaCore device, which is a really large device. And if you look at the patient on the right, you can actually see the bulge of the NovaCore beneath the rib cage and above the iliac crest. And this required a lot of space. So it wasn't a pump that was available to a lot of women or small-sized men, because they just didn't have the space to accommodate it. And you can see this patient has a hernia, and we did have issues with hernias in some of our patients, in part related to that size of the pump occupying the space there. And careful wound management was important. You can see that there initially was probably a lot of stress on that suture line because of the pump. We had issues with bleeding into that pocket. This was a 2-compartment surgery into the chest and into the abdomen, compared to what evolved in the smaller devices like the Heartware, where you're only going into the chest cavity. So the issues with bleeding weren't as significant with the 1-compartment surgery as they were with the larger devices. And also, you can imagine there's 2 potential places where infection occurred. Well, more than 2 actually, but you could have infection in the chest, you could have infection in the device pocket as well. And as I mentioned, 2 large sources or areas where we had issues with bleeding. You also see the exit side of the thoratec on your left there. Wound management was important. Jane's going to talk a little bit more about that, but acetone was already mentioned. We used liberal amounts of betadine. That was, and got really creative in fashioning dressings to secure the driveline site. And you can see the dressing on the right. That was way before the biopatch was available, and better dressing protocols and techniques, chlorhexidine, for example. The other thing that we didn't have in those days, or didn't utilize in those days, was tight glucose control, like you see now. And that obviously had some impact on the patient's healing. So I think the abdominal binder securement devices, Jen will talk about that, but that securing the device and minimizing movement of the exit site was also important. And we really didn't get too aggressive with getting patients up, and we got them up and moving, but we're very careful with that exit site, especially for the first 14 days or so. So we allowed time for that ingrowth of tissue into the velar coverings over the cannula to really secure the device in place and minimize the potential for infection at the driveline site.
So just to add on to Julie's comments about the driveline, it's obviously you can look at the Thoratec and imagine how difficult that was because the pump is outside, but securing the driveline was always important, even way back in the early 80s. Initially, the patients were just on for a short period of time, but as the bridge took off, patients were on longer. Infection obviously became an issue. Now, the Thoratec, what we used way back when was the telemetry pouches. I don't even know if they're around anymore. I doubt it, but that was something we used. The surgeons would put in sutures around the driveline and leave it in for about 7 to 10 days before it was taken off. And then, of course, the abdominal binders were mentioned. We had one patient that was on for on the Novacor for 370 days. At the time, that was the longest implant duration. We were quite proud of ourselves. And he actually was in charge of securing his Novacor driveline. And we didn't let anyone touch it except for that patient. And it was pristine. Like, I don't have any pictures, but that patient really was great. There was a nurse out of Minneapolis, I don't remember her name, that came up with a contraption that a lot of centers used around the thing. One of the other issues was because these patients had consoles, there was a long drive line and extensions into the console. So in thinking about securing the drive line, you had to think about that extension cable. It really wasn't a problem. The Novacor console was top heavy, so I had to save that from dropping to the floor a couple times when ambulating patients around the hallway. And then, of course, we had the Jarvik total artificial heart. One of the nurses once, you always had to be careful with those extensions. She accidentally ran over the pneumatic cord tubing on the artificial heart. And of course, that poor patient passed out, got the console off immediately, but the nurse never wanted to take care of another bad patient or total artificial heart for the rest of her nursing career. She was so panicked by that whole thing.
I think we all have some amazing stories from that time about our discoveries. I'll just comment that that picture on the left is one of our patients, and we all got the message that we needed to secure these devices. And so we're really appreciative of all the help that we got to do that. We always wondered in this picture if that patient's finger position was somewhat of a commentary on the experiences that he had been experiencing. I love this photo on the left. This is Jane, and it really illustrates Jane, go ahead and mute, hon. Here we go. I can do it. This really illustrates the types of patients that we were seeing. As was stated, we would wait until these patients were desperately ill before some of them got devices. And so you can see that not only was nutrition key, but mobility. And so we went from getting as creative as we could with just ambulation strategies to the strategies that you see here. So I'll ask Julie to comment on her patients.
Okay, what you're looking at, the patient in the center, is our actually the 7th patient we had done, and she was the first one to actually be implanted for more than 8 days. So she got to the point where she was able to be more mobilized than the earlier patients. These patients, by research protocol, had to have a cardiac index of 2.2 or less before they were entered into protocols. So they had a lot of end organ recovery that they needed to achieve before they were really in a place where they could get out of bed and start mobilizing. But generally the goal was to get people up and moving by 7 to 10 days post-op. Whereas today you see patients out of bed a couple days after surgery and up and active. So we have her on the stationary bike. PT was integral in planning a program for these patients. And the patient on the right is getting to a point, he's on battery now, he's getting to a point where he can be really mobile. And we started taking patients out of the hospital, getting them more active and with the goal of eventually being able to discharge patients from the hospital. At this time, we weren't doing that when you see this picture.
Yeah, definitely. I recall you being just a great center at doing those mobilization protocols. We had the opportunity to take our patients, as you see here in the top right, out on a patio. And it was always, oh my goodness, our patients were so appreciative of being able to leave the confines of the hospital and get some fresh air. And then we hadn't really thought of bocce ball as an option for activity, but I would love to hear Mary Lou talk about that.
Well, when we started the Thermocardial Systems program, we found ourselves with all these patients that were stuck in the hospital. It was only bridge to transplant, and it was obviously not applicable to or amenable to sending patients home. Our surgical step-down unit was packed all the time, so it was decided to move our patients up to our medical floor, and I was in charge of getting that to happen. And we ended up with a dozen sometimes of these supported patients on our CICU. And those nurses were fabulous. Initially, they were terrified, but they just took these patients, had activities set, they had regular lunches together. It was a little family, and they definitely got patients outside when they could, and tried to keep them mentally okay, because as you can imagine, waiting for a transplant on a pump it was terrified for the patients and the families. On the right, you have two of our total heart patients, and they set aside a room on the unit with a gym. It had a treadmill. Jim on the left is practicing stair climbing. We were waiting for the portable driver for that device because we were hoping to send him home. He had been a retransplant, and he had so many circulating antibodies that his wait was tremendously long. But I can tell you that he's doing well today, post-transplant.
What a great story.
Jill, I just want to make a comment. Mary Lou kind of first this with the bocce ball, but people got really creative and trying to motivate and trying to help patients stay upbeat. And I'll just tell you a quick story about a patient we had on BiVAD Thoratrac that we would take outside, like the picture you see there, and run a cable through a door into the unit adjacent to the spot where we take the patient. And this patient really, really missed his horse. And he talked a lot about his horse, how he would sit on the porch of his house, and his horse, he lived in the country, his horse would be brought up to the porch, and so he could spend time with his horse. And he talked about that horse a lot. So we arranged one day, we surprised him, and we had his niece bring his horse up from the town he was from, which is probably about an hour and a half drive for her. So they brought the horse up, parked in front of the fountains in front of Stanford. Stanford is not in a city. It's there's a lot of land around the medical center, so it was easy to do this. So we brought the horse up. We put him outside, thinking he was out for his usual outdoor, session. And the niece walked up with the horse, and he got to sit there with his horse and pet his horse. And there wasn't a dry eye in the area, but that was really special. So people got really creative in trying to keep patients engaged, amused, and optimistic. So that's my story.
Oh my God, that's wonderful. I really appreciate hearing that. Certainly leaving the hospital on excursions became something that we all put on our radar. I'll ask Julie to comment on her patient. I think I remember seeing this slide. Dr. Hill gave me this slide, and I was so envious that they were able to, manage something like that. We never quite got anybody to a big game, but we did really appreciate the excursions. Julie, what's going on with you and your patient there?
Well, this is also part of protocol. With the initial research protocols, you had to take patients out on excursions, escorted excursions, at least 2 times before hospital discharge. And so this is just a picture of me with a patient. Stanford Hospital is really close to a shopping center. So we just went over to the shopping center, walked around and got a bite to eat. But we do things like take them maybe to a farmer's market, or take them, one time a physical therapist and I took 2 patients out to the Stanford golf course where they could use the putting green, just something to get them out of the hospital. It was always timed, or I set it up so that a battery would deplete while we were out on our outing, so I could see how they reacted to that and if they even recognized they were having an alarm. So it's trying to set up situations where they might experience an issue out of hospital, and then it was my opportunity to see how they were able to manage that.
And when you talk about that protocol and how long and what they needed to do, was that designed by you? Was that in combination with your engineers, or?
No, these are protocols determined by the multi-center trials of the Novacor, the Jarvik, for example, and it was those companies that designed protocols in conjunction with the PI of the particular investigation.
Because I remember we did have certain things that were rigid like that, protocols, but then there was a lot that we were allowed to sort of experiment on and devise on our own. So it was a great time of learning and experimentation. And then
Jill, may I interject just one story, which we had a 14-year-old, and one of the excursions, Penn is famous for its Penn relays. It's an international track and field extravaganza. And we arranged for this 14-year-old to go over to the Penn relays. He chose to watch the women's track and field. He had a great time. I just that just brought that memory back.
Perfect. And that, we had patients of all shapes and sizes that we were trying to accommodate. I wish I could attribute the picture on the far left. I don't know exactly, but I just love the dated, the battery consoles. And again, ultimately, these patients were primarily bridged to transplant. We weren't doing destination therapy. So we were reluctant to send some of these patients home, knowing that ultimately, they were on our watch, and our goal was not this, but to get them transplanted. So Mary Lou, can you talk about, these are some of your patients and the strategies that you did and how those first discharges home actually went? You're on. You're muted. There you go.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. So I was responsible for sending our first patient home on an VE. That was just a challenge. I set up everything, as Julie mentioned. These patients were required to be on mandated excursions, but we eventually transitioned him home. He was a bridge to transplant. The patient in the middle is the first patient I sent home on a TLC2 driver, which was absolutely terrifying. She was a BIVAD. She went on to be transplanted. And the patient on the right is a hardware patient. We were part of that trial as well. And she was probably on support for nearly 2 years. We got to know these patients. They were family. They would come into clinic, share how they were coping at home. The training was tremendous. Pre-COVID, we had the patients there. Now I'm told it's a lot of telemedicine and virtual training. But we had patients, families, and any support they wanted to learn how to be there to respond to any emergencies. But the patient in the middle, we were in hysterics one time in the clinic. It was around the holidays. Here she is with her driver, which she had to lift upstairs to get into her townhouse. And her husband decided to give her a really special Christmas gift of a vacuum cleaner. So we were just hysterical talking about this. But these patients were our family. We got to know them intimately.
That is a perfect segue into this line. This is the picture on the left there is a patient from Cal Pacific. And again, as you mentioned, these were very long admissions. We did not have a transitional unit. We developed it as a result of these patients. These were our family, and we really got to know these patients so well. But ultimately, you're waiting for someone else to die so that they could be transplanted. So it was just a really strange time of psychosocial support and you know how we were all, you know, just this incredibly close you know, support system for these patients. And Mary Lou, if I'll you know, you can unmute yourself and comment on the silver streak if you would. Whoops, sorry, my bad. There we go.
This is back in the thermocardio systems IP experience. And these patients developed, you know, a relationship with their devices. This one was named. He had his little mascot there. But also, for those of you who had experience with this technology, we had to vent it regularly, which sometimes caused tremendous symptoms to the patients. So that was quite a challenge, but the patients would remind the nurses, it's time for my vent, so that they would know to come in and push the button and make sure that the pneumatic driver was replenished. Yes, that patient named his pump, and he started a trend. Everybody wanted to name their pump something.
All right, and then I'll ask you to comment on these gentlemen. It looks like they're having a good time there. You filled up your unit.
And again, this was an outdoor excursion, all organized by our wonderful CICU nursing staff. And you can see some of the patients on the left were just on pumps, probably Milrinone, all bridge to transplant. They elected a mayor. They had parties. They were just would surround the patients as they were off to their transplant when that wonderful event happened. It was a wonderful community.
Yeah, Jill, I know they say that we did for our patients is we actually had a social worker, Mary Bird, who had organized weekly support groups for transplant patients. But we incorporated the VAD patients into that. So we would walk patients from the hospital over to the Cardiothoracic Surgery Department where the support groups are held. And so that not only were patients supportive of each other, in helping them get through this. But also the transplant patients were encouraging. And a lot of the transplant patients in support groups were actually patients who had had VADs as well. So there was a whole community guided by social work that developed. So support came from not only family and the staff, but also from other patients.
Yeah, I recall our chaplains were quite involved. Jane, those are your patients. Can you tell us about them?
Sure. So the gentleman on the right, he was our record-breaking Novacor patient. So he was in the hospital for 370 days. So you can imagine, what did this gentleman do all that time? Well, he would sit out in the hallway and paint eggs. And he made beautiful eggs. I wish I had a picture of it. I know Dr. Pennington used to show his eggs. It was really impressive. Everybody got one of the patient's eggs. He also, we had a huge birthday party for him. We brought in a woman, like in kind of a skimpy outfit and a physician lab coat. And we were all in this conference room. It was jammed. And this lady came in with her little boa and sat on his lap. And he, if anybody knows anything about the Novacor, they know it had a high output, right? And so this man maxed out his output. The alarms were going, he's sweating. And so we had to stop that. We actually had to get her out of the room. He was so, so excited, I guess. And so it was fun. We would have romantic dinners for he and his wife. I used to cut his hair. And luckily he didn't have much hair, but you can imagine the press when this patient actually got transplanted and went home. So he was going to get interviewed by the press when he was ready for discharge. And he said, Jane, will you cut my hair one last time? I said, are you kidding me? You're going home. Go to a professional. And now I cut his hair one last time before he went home. So it was fun times. We would tutor kids when the parent was in the hospital for a long time, played games. So it was fun times back then.
Thank you. I proved to everyone that I am the pack rat of the group, although I must admit all of us had some of these amazing photos. We all saved some memorabilia. Education was so important then and now. And there was such great collaboration. I became a CNS for our unit in 1987, and on the left is our first VAD all-day course in 1988. And this was our surgeons, our cardiologists, I think one of the vendors, and it was just really a group effort, but we really didn't have nursing expertise to lead a lot of this. It was really our surgeons that were driving it. And then in 1991, I got the opportunity to participate with several members of this panel at a national meeting. And it was the first time that we had our own sessions and were allowed to really contribute. And I just, it was, we all commented on the fact that we were sharing and learning from each other. And I'd just be delighted if any of you would like to comment on that time and how that worked among our really tight-knit community.
Well, I can say something. There was really a time of collaboration, not only within your team and your own institution, but at any time I could pick up the phone and I could call. Maybe I'd call Jane Reedy and ask her what her experience was with this, or how do you do that, or so tremendous support, institution to institution, colleague to colleague, and also a lot of involvement and close relationships with the companies that were actually there to support us in and bring us ideas from other institutions as well.
I'd like to share my wonder about the sharing. I was all by myself in Penn, absolutely no idea what I was doing. And when we started the VE, Dr. Mehmet Oz and Donna Mancini were up at Columbia, and they were gracious enough to invite me up. I spent the day with Margaret Flannery and Kathy Cantonese. I think her name is Idrisi now. And they were always available to me by phone when I was actually dealing with a patient. It was invaluable. So that years later, when we started the association, the ICAC Association, that really pulled us together. But I kudos to Thoratec because they brought us to a yearly conference. And that's where we met each other in person and shared our ideas for patient care, for dressing routines, and all the challenges we had. So that collaborative unity was invaluable.
Thank you.
And
As we sort of wind down here, and look to the future, I think one of the real changes that we're seeing is these teams are not so small anymore. We're all seeing, large participants. And again, destination therapy is just such a different animal than bridge to transplant. Mary Lou, I know this is your team. If you would just briefly comment on kind of the changes that you've seen in scope as to who's at the table for these patients now. And you're on mute right now.
yes, this is SRO, our weekly meeting. It's Friday mornings. You have representatives from social work, from nutrition, from pharmacy. Up on the screen, we'll review data on patients that we're evaluating for DT. But also what happens is we have outreach with Geisinger and Christiana, other centers, so that we'll teleconference with those centers. Either they've referred patients to us, or they're asking us to refer, or they are collaborating with the care of a patient. So it's just a phenomenal meeting every week that we have at Penn. And I know other centers are doing the same.
Definitely. And then, because of the partnership between industry and I would just love to hear from Jane about, her role and how she sees that moving in the future.
Sure. So I transitioned into the industry side in the early 90s. I've been involved with all these pumps displayed here at some point in my career. I've been fortunate. I've been able to travel around the world. I've been to hundreds of hospitals, collaborated with clinicians, seen countless implants, been in a lot of ICUs. So it's been a fun ride for me. And on the other end, I've been on the product development side of things and gotten I've seen how industry really tries hard to optimize their technology and improve patient outcomes. So the clinician side and the industry side really has driven to make the best technology and have the best outcome for the patients. And so I think that's really important. So if you look at the technology, you can see the Thoratec PVAD, the first out of the box. And I want to give a little credit to Dr. Pierce and Donikai. That was the original name of the pump. They were the two that developed it at Hershey Medical Center. Dr. Pei was involved a lot. And so that was the workhorse originally. Obviously, these devices get obsoleted, the pulsatile NovaCore. Then we moved into the HeartMate 2 and the axial pumps, such as the Jarvik and the Micromed device. And the technologies now moved to the centrifugal durable VAD. So there's the HVAD. And most recently, the HeartMate 3. I'm with a company right now, CH Biomedical, which has a maglev centrifugal pump. I'm very excited about that. So that's maglev technology is very cutting edge. We'll see how that moves forward. I know there's other people out there with innovative ideas and companies with product in R&D stage right now. So it's been a fun ride, and it'll be interesting to see what's out there in the next few decades.
So in just a moment, we'll review some of the questions, but before we end, I really wanted to thank not only our panelists, but acknowledge some outstanding contributors to our nursing understanding of mechanical circulatory support, how we should manage these patients. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure I've left people off that should be on here, but really wanted to just acknowledge the outstanding work that's gone on. So let me see if I can take a look at some of our questions that have come in, and really thank everyone for their participation today. The panelists, I could not have been more grateful for the time that they put in today. Julie, Jane, and Mary Lou, you are just outstanding partners then and now. So thank you so much for that. So let me see if I can take a look at some of these questions. Let's see. Oh, I stand on the shoulder of giants. I love that. That's wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and ask a question for you guys. What do you see as the greatest challenge lying ahead? It strikes me that we've learned so much and come so far. What do you think is really going to be the challenges of the future now that we've tackled all the wound care and nutrition and how to get out of the hospital issues? Julie, would you comment first?
Well, I'm not sure we've tackled all the wound care issues. The Achilles heel really of these devices is that driveline. And until we can get rid of that and we have transcutaneous transfer of power, we'll still always have issues with the driveline. Even though they're much smaller, the infection rate is quite diminished from what it used to be. It still is an issue. And then, well, let me leave it at that, and let others contribute.
Jane, would you like to comment on our future challenges?
Well, I agree with Julie. We haven't tackled the complications. Perhaps they're not as severe as some of the complications aren't as severe as we've seen. I mean, we've definitely made progress in the bleeding front and the stroke front and some of the other complications, but that's still a challenge. I don't think anyone has the solution to those right now. Even with the fully implantable systems, there's going to be infection challenges and some other challenges associated with that. So there's still a lot of work to be done, I think. So I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer to what the solution is.
I don't think we have to have all the answers right now, but I do appreciate that we were some of the first to start asking the questions. And I think that's a huge step forward.
Another shout out I'd just like to make is we're looking initially quality of life, especially as nurses experience that with patients and getting to know them, that hadn't really developed in terms of a scientific question, but a lot of work has been done. And of late, Kathy Grady, just wanted to give her a shout out. She's done a tremendous amount and made a lot of contributions to our understanding of quality of life that patients experience on VAS. And she's just wrapping up a multi-center NIH-funded trial looking at quality of life in patients on VAS support. So that's another area that we can focus on and more fine-tune moving forward is contributing to that nursing science.
Thank you. Absolutely. Mary Lou, can you comment on our future challenges?
Well, I still think anticoagulation is still a major challenge. I remember fondly the XVE with its textured membranes and its porcine valves, and all they needed was an aspirin, unless they had some sort of comorbidity. We are so lucky to have a dedicated pharmacist now at our team to help with training, and I don't think they've transitioned off warfarin yet. I think they're looking at Eliquis and other new generation anticoagulants, but I'm not sure where we are that way. I do want to definitely reiterate what Julie said about quality of life and palliative care, because these are destination patients. Having collaborated with many, hospice nurses, because it's end of life care that we need to be sure we're doing appropriately for this patient population.
Sorry, a little technical on my part. I'm frantically pushing buttons. Before we end, I would say from my own standpoint, I've done a great deal of work with resuscitation, and I'm delighted that the STS will soon be looking at embarking on evidence-based recommendations for how we should be managing resuscitation in patients with mechanical circulatory support. So I think that's another exciting avenue that we'll be exploring. And I'm trying to get to the questions, and I think that's been my problem as I try and look for the questions. Let me see. I think at this point, I'm going to stop and see if Catherine has some questions that she might read for us, or otherwise we will conclude our session. On behalf of our participants today and CTSNet, we are delighted that you were able to attend. I could not be more thrilled to be on this panel with these outstanding giants, and thank you again for tuning in today.